This question says, if my dog looks at another dog and doesn't bark and chooses to turn her attention back on me and I reward that, that's positive reinforcement and that's a good way to use it, right? So we're having a conversation about the literal definition of positive reinforcement, which is as a component of operant conditioning, where we are increasing or decreasing the likelihood of a behavior by adding or subtracting something from the scenario immediately after the behavior occurs. We're talking about how positive reinforcement is often now used as an umbrella term to mean training that doesn't use force or suppressive methods, and kind of why that is a problem. And so this commenter is asking a really, really good question. So let's break this down. So when we are giving the dog the treat in this scenario to reinforce the checking in, because there's actually a lot happening here. The positive reinforcement aspect would be the reinforcement of the behavior of checking in. So we're saying, when you look at me, I give you a treat, and that makes looking at me more likely, assuming the dog finds the treat to be reinforcing. In this context, we're also putting a lot of other contingencies. So it's not just looking at me, it's looking at me after you've looked at another dog and when you haven't barked. So from a purely positive reinforcement operant standpoint, that's not likely to be very effective because it's really unclear what the dog is being reinforced for. Because there are all of these different pieces that are required to create that reinforcement. So the best positive reinforcement is going to have very clear contingencies. With positive reinforcement, we want that reinforcement to come immediately after the behavior, and it should be a single, well-defined behavior for the consistent learning we're looking for. The other piece here is that if we're waiting to see if the dog barks or if the dog does bark, we have allowed the dog to remain in or even set them up to be in a situation that they cannot handle, meaning that they are strengthening their negative associations with that trigger. So if I say, oh, you barked, you don't get a cookie, I've actually taken some steps back in my work because I have strengthened the negative association between my dog and that trigger. And this is in part where we start to talk about classical conditioning. So we're not talking about operant conditioning, which is about the behavior, because the behavior is a symptom. The hard staring, the barking, that's a symptom of the underlying arousal. What I am much more concerned about is the arousal and the negative association and the negative emotional association with the trigger. And so using this setup, I may be actually creating associations between my dog and the trigger that move me in the wrong direction, that increase the negative association instead of creating a positive one. Which kind of brings me to part of what we do want to be doing, which is focusing on the association. So in classical conditioning, the dog appears and that equals a treat. The dog appears and that equals a treat. The behavior is irrelevant, except in how it guides our setup. So if my dog is barking, it means I need to change my setup. If my dog is hard staring at the other dog, they haven't started vocalizing yet, but they're really hard staring, I need to change my setup. If my dog is avoiding the other dog, if they are like, I'm just going to sniff this grass over here and I'm going to pretend that other dog doesn't exist, or I'm just going to really focus on getting treats from you and focus on this game and I'm going to pretend that other dog exists, that setup needs to be changed. The dog needs more space. And so the setup of waiting to see if the dog barks or not and then reinforcing the check-in really misses the mark on the classical component of that. If I wanted to say, well, I'm reinforcing my dog for looking calmly at the other dog, I'm not doing that if I'm reinforcing when my dog checks in. Okay, so that's the positive reinforcement piece, the operant piece. Now let's start to also talk about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is not about reinforcing or punishing behaviors. That's operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is about associations. So this is Pavlov, right? When Pavlov had the dogs and he would ring a bell and then feed the dogs, and then the dogs started salivating when they heard the bell, even if there was no food present. So classical conditioning is about making associations, not about behaviors. So counter conditioning is when we're taking a negative emotion and we're turning it either into a neutral emotion or a positive emotion. So we're saying that dog appearing predicts good things. Dog equals cheese, dog equals cheese, dog equals cheese. And that's part of what we're paying attention to in behavior therapy. Much more than operant conditioning, we're looking at classical learning. It's not the only piece, but it is more relevant, I would say, than operant behavior. So part of creating a good setup for that classical learning to occur, that counter conditioning, is that I need my dog to be in what we call a green zone state of mind. So stress levels are down. They are at the level where the dog can most effectively process information, engage in curiosity, engage in pro-social behaviors. And having stress levels at that level is important not only for behavioral health, but also mental, emotional, and physical health. And so a big part of creating a training setup is ensuring that my setup allows the dog to be exposed to a trigger at an intensity and a distance and for an amount of time that allows them to be in that green zone brain. I also want to look at their emotional state, because that green, yellow, orange, red tells me about stress hormones. It doesn't tell me about emotions. And so I want my dog to not only feel safe and secure, but to feel positively, not to feel anxious or frustrated or nervous or unsure. So let's jump back to the positive reinforcement piece of this for a second, where we're saying I'm reinforcing the dog for not barking and seeing the other dog and checking in with me. In that scenario, if I'm waiting to see if my dog barks or not, my dog is very likely going up that stress scale if I haven't intentionally taken care to craft this setup appropriately, and is potentially we're getting a strengthening of the negative emotions. And so if I'm waiting and my dog goes from green zone, engaged with the environment, curious, to, oh gosh, there's another dog, avoidant, looking away, displacement, sniffing over here, or just really focused on me and the food, or they're hard staring and their tail is flagging, or their tail is tucked and they're kind of starting to lean away, or they go into a reaction where they're barking, growling, lunging, or trying to drag me home, or they're having like a fidget response and jumping all over me, grabbing the leash. The biggest thing that I've done there is strengthen a negative association. And the behaviors that are being rehearsed, if I'm seeing unwanted behaviors, are also being reinforced because they are providing the dog relief. That is why the dog is engaging in them. They're trying to displace some of that arousal. And so those behaviors are self-reinforcing. So what I would rather do is create a training setup where my dog can be in that good state of mind. They can engage with the environment, stress hormones are low, they feel safe. And I would rather just pair the dog with the treat. So I would say, your trigger appears, the dog, the person, the noise, whatever it is, and that predicts something good is coming. And that order of operations is really important because you don't want the good thing to predict the scary thing and make the good thing bad. And so it's an art and a science. But then I'm going to further complicate things and say that operant and classical conditioning are not the only options out there either. And I want to make sure that doesn't get lost in this conversation where we're talking about the difference between operant and classical conditioning. Those are still just a tiny little section of what we're doing. Now, there's a saying that classical and operant conditioning are always happening, because when we're doing anything, behaviors are being reinforced and punished, even unintentionally. New associations are being made, even unintentionally. That is happening whether we are trying to do it or not. But there are a lot of situations where that's not our focus. It's a byproduct, and we need to be aware of it as a byproduct. But we're also doing things like building the ability to self-regulate, to have a big emotion, and then access coping skills that bring us back down. We're doing things to build resilience to stress, which can include things like building learned industriousness, behavioral flexibility, by increasing agency is a huge one, letting the dog feel like they have control over their environment, increasing communication, letting them know that we can hear them. We're teaching coping skills so that when the dog is self-regulating, they can reach for things that are helpful for them, including things like teaching them that they can move away and how they can move away in situations where their flight has been restricted, like being on leash. And that really just scratches the surface. We're going to make a video digging more into this based on another commenter's question. But thank you for this question. I really appreciate it.